Hi, this is Heidi Burgess. I'm with Beyond Intractability, and I have two guests with me today. Jay Rothman, who's been a colleague and friend for many, many years. Jay is president of the ARIA Group, which he created years ago. It's a creative conflict engagement firm, which does analysis and intervention in deep-rooted, usually identity-based conflicts. And one of the things that I hope that we have time to talk about today is that I think that he is a field leader in what we call the scale-up problem, which is the problem of taking conflict resolution strategies, which are usually done around a table with a few people, and scaling them up to community-wide conflicts, even national or international conflicts, which is, I think, one of the biggest problems in our field. And Jay's been a leader in addressing that. And that's one of the things we'll be talking about today, I'm sure. And also with me is Daniella Cohen, who is an associate with the ARIA Group. She is originally from South Africa, and she did a lot of work in South Africa with refugees and immigrants and DEI, and she's also working with DEI issues with youth and adults in Canada, which is now where she's located. So Daniella and Jay, welcome.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thanks.
Can you start by telling us about the situation in Ohio that you recently intervened in that we're primarily talking about today? So tell us what was going on.
So we're in Yellow Springs, Ohio. This is the home of Antioch College and has a long history of being a place of inclusion and progressive politics. Also, it's been a place in which educational innovation is at its foundation, with Antioch College being here for 150 years and a commitment to education being very core to the identity of this town, as well as there's a big history of inclusion, civil rights activism, and so forth. But over the last 6 years, Yellow Springs has become deeply divided over school levy issues. It's failed its levy for the last 2 times, for the first time ever in its history. Yellow Springs has always supported whatever the school districts has asked it to support. But for the last 6 years, it's failed twice, and the town has become increasingly polarized around contending values. So the values that we actually did an analysis around, we were brought in by the local community foundation to try to do, first of all, an analytical process of understanding what was going on that was dividing the town and the school board for so long. And then we followed that up with a 3-month intervention. The analysis was built significantly on the work that Heidi, you, and Guy have been doing around developing a systems analysis. So we read, I'm actually forgetting the name of the process right now. Remind me.
Massively parallel peace building?
Your massively parallel peace building process. We use the matrix, which again, I should have in front of me, but it basically describes what are the overlying issues and the underlying issues, and then helps you do an analysis of what's going on in the environment. So I used that as I did a month-long analysis, basically going to school board members, to community members, to community leaders, and saying, why is the town so polarized? What's going on that's led us to be so antagonistic to each other around these issues and unsuccessful about reaching agreement about how to go forward? So we spent a month doing that analysis, and then the foundation asked me to continue to do an intervention with the school board and the community to try to build some collaborative momentum out of what had been a very stuck process. And that's when I brought Daniella in to work with me, and she came from Vancouver to Yellow Springs for 3 months, and we took on this project of first working with the school board directly, doing coaching, being sounding boards for individual members, working with the school board staff, the Board of Education staff, the superintendent, the treasurer, basically trying to help get a larger perspective of what's going on, depersonalize, depolarize, and help people get a view of what's going on and what could move things forward. This then led to lots of different interventions that we can talk about in more detail, including a World Cafe, including some mediations, including a board retreat, and then finally a community-wide survey where we asked people to talk about which option for the future of the schools they would prefer and why they'd prefer them, and then also their larger visions for Yellow Springs as a community and its future. And then to go right to the finale, which was only 2 weeks ago, the school board, which had been tremendously divided, in fact, it had been voted in a sense to support the divisions in town, reached a 5-0 consensus on a plan to go forward. And that's where our intervention wound up. And we feel very pleased and very hopeful about that.
That's great. Daniella, do you want to add anything before I start quizzing you too about what Jay said?
No, I mean, I think that's a great kind of summary overall, capturing it before we get into any of the specifics.
All right. Let's go back to your beginning, Jay. What were the values that you saw primarily clashing after you did your initial value analysis?
It was very interesting, right? Because this was an issue around money, right? Are we going to raise $50 million, this teeny town of 3,500 people? Are we going to raise $50 million or $25 million or $0 to rebuild our schools because they are in very bad shape, objectively? So on the one hand, we had this whole economic dynamic, which then was rebuild the schools versus affordability. There's already a sense that Yellow Springs is unaffordable to be the inclusive place that it desires to be, that it aspires to be, that it has been. So now we have, quality of education as embodied by facilities that are up to the task, which they are not, versus an affordable town that is a very strong priority for this community identity. Then we also had the issue of environmental sustainability. People saying we should only remodel these schools because if we're going to rebuild them, not only is it going to be way more expensive, we're also going to have to fill the landfill with old buildings that we could have remodeled. We should be reusing and recycling, not new buildings. So we had a very large movement that was saying we're against what might economically be the wisest because it's maybe in the long term going to be smartest to rebuild, but ecologically it's not smartest. And then we had another group that was concerned about green space because they were talking about moving. We have 2 campuses in town, and they were talking about moving one campus to where the other campus is. And then that would leave a large space in the middle of town that folks were afraid was going to then be developed. So there was a green space group that lobbied extremely strongly not to change the footprint of our school systems. So we had these 4 contending values. And people were getting very personalized about it. There was a very vitriolic Facebook page. So things really got to the level of identity-based conflict, which is, as you suggested, has been the focus of my career. And here it is in my backyard.
Yeah. Did it line up with traditional identities that we see in the United States, Republican, Democrat, or was it all? It sounds like it's mostly progressive Democrats in Yellow Springs breaking into
Yellow Springs votes Democratic and beyond pretty much universally. The minorities, and there are probably 5 or maybe 8% of folks who might be voting Republican. So it's a rather radically progressive town.
Okay.
And that, one of the sad jokes that I sometimes use when I'm working with progressives is, something that the conservatives do that we don't do very well is they stand in a circle and they shoot out. We stand in a circle and we shoot in. So we take each other out. And we agree on so much. When school boards are fighting over critical race theory, that's the farthest that could be happening here. We'd say, bring it on. Everybody would in this town. So that we are fighting about these identities and ideals is within a container where we mostly agree with each other. So maybe the narcissism of minor differences becomes very strong here.
Does it help, do you think, that the folks mostly agreed with each other? It strikes me that it's possible that that would make it easier to come to consensus, because people must have an image that before this whole issue, 6 years ago, we were all on the same side.
Yeah. I just said this towards the tail end of what I said, and then Daniella, maybe you'll comment on this, but this notion of the narcissism of minor differences, I think, matters a lot, which is we expect of each other that we agree with each other. And so, like you do in family members, right? And then when you disagree with each other, it's very disappointing, and it hurts even more than when the person you expect to disagree with you disagrees with you. I mean, of course, we all believe in the environment. How could you possibly want to tear down these buildings? Of course, we need the best quality of space for our kids to learn and move into the future. How could you not support whatever our kids need, right? Of course, we have to protect our green space. You know that. We love the beauty of our town. How could you not support that? So then it becomes very personal, right?
Yeah.
Because we expect of our neighbors that we basically are here because we agree on a basic set of common commitments and values. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would add is that, I think something that we saw very strongly was that everybody really cares about this issue in the town. Like, this is deeply personal and deeply important. So everybody's invested in this and invested in the process, invested in the outcome. But people are looking at it from very different angles. So there was an event that was held by the Village Mediation Project, a World Cafe event, and they did a very interesting exercise in that, where they had the 4 values in a kind of rectangle, and they asked people to put a dot, where they kind of stood, where they felt the most strongly in terms of what they wanted, and spoke about that, and then listened to other people speak, and then tried to take the perspective of somebody else of why their value was really important to them. And after that, had a chance to move their dot if they'd moved at all. And people moved. And I just, I remember being at a table and having this very interesting conversation where somebody said, like, for me, because I don't have kids, the issue that was really strong in my focus was the affordability. And that's what I was thinking about, because that's what's most applicable to me. And I wasn't really thinking about the other perspectives because they don't directly apply to me. And only when I heard somebody else speaking about that, then my perspective broadened, and I went, okay, hang on a second, there's other things going on here as well. And I now understand more why you might care so deeply about that perspective. So I think it just kind of showed, like Jay's saying, all of these issues are important. But when people are very focused on their own perspective and they care so passionately about that, and it's in conflict with another perspective, it seems to be we can either have that or we can have this. Then it becomes more and more challenging for people to understand why others are so passionate about the values that they are.
Am I correct in assuming that this World Cafe did that with people in small groups?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did.
Sorry. Yeah.
So did the dots move further towards the center?
So it was interesting. In some of the groups they did. Some was more movement than others, but there was definitely movement, which I thought was quite interesting. Just in that one exercise of bringing people together. And then I think one thing we would probably want to say is that, there was a group of people that came to that event that didn't include everybody in the town. And that's kind of where our survey came in later on, was to try to get input from a wider perspective than people who were able to attend that event or who were interested in attending that event.
So that's something I should have asked earlier. How did you get people for that event? Did you just advertise it and anybody who wanted to come would come? Or did you invite people? Or
So we partnered with the village mediation program on this, and basically supported them and their networks as they did outreach. As much as possible and whenever possible, we tried to stay behind the scenes. So they were the public facing body that called together this World Cafe, and we helped them formulate and frame some of the ways to present it, but it was really theirs. And one of the things that Daniella just spoke about in terms of the movement of the dots, I'd say that might be a good metaphor for our whole intervention. Things were really stuck, right? People's positions were stuck, people's feelings were stuck. There was a sense of stuckness in the town that these over 6 years. And so sort of our main idea throughout the whole thing was get things moving, keep things moving. And as much as possible, let's get them moving in a forward constructive way. But even if there's some antagonism that surfaces, even if there's some things that go bad, let's just keep going. Don't let them get stuck. Keep the conversations going, keep the public involved, and get more and more of the public involved, not only to gather their ideas, but mostly to have them have a sense that their voice matters. Because a lot of people were getting to a sense of, a plague on all of your houses. You guys can't agree, so we'd rather not spend all of this money on this anyway. And if you can't agree, then okay, we're just going to back off. We're not going to read the paper anymore. We're not going to listen to these conversations anymore. We're going to vote against it, So I think we help to get rid of that excuse because things are not stuck, right? Now the board is moving together. People are still, whether it's going to pass or not, we don't know because that's not till November. And there's still plenty of hurdles, but there is now this sense of forward momentum. I use a systems analysis throughout the whole time, and the simple ideas of, the vicious cycles, in this case of disagreement, of antagonism, no violence, but verbal violence and aggression in that sense, versus the constructive, virtuous cycle of cooperation. And that's what we really continued to focus on, and I think was embodied by the consensus at the end that came out of an integrative solution, one in which all of these values, to some extent, were met in the agreement they came up with. It was breathtaking how they did it. It was a little surprising. We didn't know it was going to happen until the moment that it happened.
Explain that more. Tell us how they did it and what the agreement was that they came up with.
So what they had was 10 different options. Their poor architect, he was working with them for 6 years, and option 1 got failed, and then option 2 got failed in the last 2 days, and then they came up with 10 more. And they tried to boil them down, and they boiled down to 8, and then they boiled them down to 6, and then finally they boiled them down to 4 options. The options ranged in price from 35 million to 55 million, all of which were outrageously expensive. Had they agreed to a levy 6 years before, it would have been half as expensive, even for the most expensive option. So time was not in their favor, and they knew that. The more they waited, the more expensive this project was going to go. There were some threats if they didn't fulfill this project that the school district would start failing. Not sure whether that would happen, but there was some of that fear. So there's a lot of pressure.
What does school district failing mean?
It means that the state takes it over and consolidates it with a neighbor.
Oh, can see where that wouldn't be wanted.
So, and the neighbors are usually of a different political stripe than Yellow Springs. And we would still have to pay. We might not just have much voice on the school board anymore. So, it was existentially threatening for those who really thought long-term about a possible next failure. So the stakes were high. A lot of folks were very worked up about it, very frustrated by it. And they got down to 4 options. The options included full remodeling, no rebuilding, to full rebuilding and no remodeling, keeping 2 campuses, joining them into 1 campus, adding a new pre-K school as you did some readjusting of space. And what they ended up doing was a hybrid model. And the hybrid model was they were going to rebuild the high school and middle school, and they were then going to deeply remodel the elementary school and add a pre-K to it, They're also going to change grades. So it was going to, the middle school was going to start at 4th grade, so that kids who used to be in the elementary school would now go up to the new school. The price tag was significant, but it was subsidized by a lot of money from the state for new buildings that remodeled buildings would not qualify for. So there were all sorts of log rolling that went on. There was all sorts of integrative bargainings that actually went on. Unfortunately, people kept using the word compromise, and I tried to steer them away from that, saying, I don't think you've compromised on the deepest concerns that you actually have. I think you've all got them fulfilled. Not 100%, but in ways that are very significant. So the environmentalists, the green space folks, the quality building folks, the economic affordability folks, well, there's something to say about that last one that's a little bit different. But in the package that was put together, everybody's deepest concerns were at least minimally met. And I call that an integrative solution.
Yeah. So what happens now?
So let me talk about that 4th one, because the 4th one is still a work in progress, which is when people were asked why they didn't support the last levy, a number of folks said, I may or may not be able to afford it, but I'm concerned my neighbors will not be able to afford it. And that was a lovely sentiment of concern for a diverse community. So one of the ideas that came up actually during the World Cafe was a fund called Leave No Resident Behind. That would be a way worked out with the credit union and the community foundation that people who felt that this passing of a levy, especially the expensive levy, this was not the most expensive one that was passed, but it was pretty high up there, that it might lead them to having to leave the town. So the idea was to come up with a fund that could subsidize them, and that is underway. It's complicated. It's not positive if or how it will work, but there's a lot of commitment to seeing if it can work. And I think even that effort is meaningful, that the affordability issue is super challenging. So how can the town rally together to support people for whom it will be even more challenging than for others? So at this point, we finished our job with this survey, and the survey we got 700 people, which is about 1/5 of our town, and we were pleased.
Did you send it to everybody?
We sent it to everybody. Everybody got a postcard in the mail. We put advertisements in the newspaper. We posted them around town. We used basic social media networks. We invited community leaders to actually help us draft and redraft the survey. It was a long, well, in a sense, it wasn't long. It was fast, but it was demanding. We did it in about 3 or 4 weeks, I think. And we turned around the data analysis in 3 days.
Wow.
Anyway, Heidi, if you got a chance to look at the survey, it's online. Anybody can see it by going to the Yellow Springs Community Foundation website, yellowspringscommunityfoundation.org. And there's a link that takes them to the survey results. And one of the things that we did, Heidi, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but we had 2 sets of qualitative responses, which is actually one of my areas of expertise of qualitative research, action research around people's goals and values. And so we asked them, first of all, to tell us why they chose, of the 4 options that they selected, they could rank order the 4 that were remaining for the board to choose down to 1. And they were to tell us which they preferred, to rank order them, and then why. And that was, for some people, that was a couple paragraph response. 700 times a couple paragraphs is a lot of data. Yeah. Then we asked them what we called a bonus question, which of course, as you know, Heidi, one of my main interests besides identity conflict is future vision. How do we go from the way that we're stuck from the past into how we can cooperate in the future? So we asked them as a bonus question for their vision for the future of Yellow Springs. And we got equally amount of very rich, interesting, heartening input. And I told people, you should read this, because if you're disappointed in Yellow Springs, this will raise your esteem for it once again. Because people's thoughts and ideals for a beautiful future were really meaningful and grounded. So we ran both of these through Chat GPT and asked all sorts of questions like, can you give us a summary of the 3 main points or the 5 main points in 3 pages and bring out the passion? And it did. Wow. And so able to to boil down hundreds of pages of data within 3 days and present it back as very consumable. And folks were very pleased. Folks said to us, we feel like, our voice was heard. It was wonderful for us to have an outlet because we've been feeling kind of silenced. And we got lots of grief before the research went out. Lots. Oh boy, that's a whole book. But once it came out and the results, this was just on Friday before the board was to make its decision on Monday. So there's no causal assessment here saying, the survey results or our work of 3 months is what led the board to this consensus. But I think there's certainly a sense that we contributed to a constructive atmosphere that supported this collaborative outcome. And so too with the survey, that it created a sense of constructive voice, of moving away from the diatribe to the dialogue, moving away from the polarization to the collaboration. And I'm very pleased and proud of what all of us did. And it really was, if we were behind the scenes, in front of the picture were dozens and dozens of people who were working pretty nonstop to try to change the dynamics and help build a constructive momentum. So,
yeah, and I just wanted to add as well, I think one thing, really interesting about the survey was it gave solid data. So even in the board meeting that followed, a couple of people referred to the survey results. So it just kind of gave this concrete, tangible, factual data that people could refer to, rather than, he said, she said, they said, kind of what was going on. So I think that was an important function as well, that there was some solid data from a large proportion of the community that could be referred to. Yeah. So, and another thing I wanted to add that I think was really interesting is there was a question in there about, if your preferred option for the facilities wasn't on the ballot, would you still vote? And 43% of people said yes, they would. So that was also really important information, because it showed, even if I can't get exactly what I want, I still want this to go forward. I still want to participate. I still want to create a better future for my town in terms of the school facilities. And so when people saw that, I think, like Jay is saying, that kind of adds to the feeling, okay, I'm willing to work with you. We're willing to work together. We all want what's best for the town. And I think we saw that when we got to the 5-0 vote with the school board, they kind of came to, okay, it's not going to be this and it's not going to be this, but let's try to make it work. Let's find something that can work, that we can all get behind, and they did,
Right. So, one thing that was also interesting, Heidi, before they voted, is there was community input. And I think there were about 10 people who spoke, and at least 3 or 4 of them said, just make a decision board, just agree on something. And I think that was a useful admonition.
So you said this at the beginning, and I'm trying to remember. I know that the previous 2 bond issues failed, but if there was a bond issue, that implies to me that the school board must have come to an agreement about what that bond issue was going to be for. So was the school board divided before this? I think
this is one of the really interesting backstories here, which is the last one failed. And maybe it failed because there was a very large group of people who were advocating for the affordable option, the most affordable option, which was remodeling only. And they were doing it both for economic reasons and for environmental reasons. And 2 of them, representing this large voice, were elected to the board.
Okay.
So the board was divided by 2 to 3 throughout almost its whole 16 months before this period. 16 months? I think that's right. So they were really divided on these 2 against these 3, or this population they were representing against this population they were representing. And bringing them to 5, in which they found their way to 5-0, was about converging. I was going to say concession and convergence, but I don't think that's the right language. That suggests a more negotiation language, that everybody's going to give up something. This was finding a way that everybody could really have what they most deeply cared about agreed upon. Now, again, we're still in trouble when it comes to affordability, because it's just crazy the way we fund our schools, right? But that's what we do. And we have a population that is very diverse economically. And this is going to be a stress on everybody. So it's not a cakewalk to say that this is going to pass. We do, however, have that sense of consensus on a board that was divided. And that makes such a big difference when they were divided on very substantive issues. So now the folks who came saying, look, this is the best we can do. And we accept it as good enough. And we want you to get behind it too, right? So the folks who are representing the environmental voice and the affordability voice, I believe will be leaders in saying, community, we have to rally behind this. And the sense of being a divided board that the community could dismiss, all right, I said before, a plague on all your houses, they can't do that. They've shown that despite their differences and through their differences, they're working together. So that's a model of leadership that I think the community will respond to. I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
I'm really interested in your use of ChatGPT. 2 questions about that. Assuming that you personally read through all of the responses too, given that, did you find the ChatGPT summary credible?
Very credible. Now, I edited it. I didn't use it as it gave it back to me, and Daniella then edited my edits, and we felt very comfortable with it in the end. But I was amazed by it, and I was baffled how I was going to share this data in 3 days. Right. The reason there was such a rush is that the survey had been delayed because of some pushback we got that was very unpleasant, and we had to slow down. So instead of having a week to do the analysis, we had 3 days. I think 10 days we were supposed to have. So how I was going to give back this data to people, and one of the principles of action research is you gather data from people to give it back to them. Not only to gather your evidence or prove your points or whatever you're trying to do with it, but you give people back their data so they feel like their voice matters and they feel like they've been heard. And I felt that ChatGPT, so we had 500 responses, I think, for your preferences. And I randomly took 100 responses, and I then instructed GPT. I think I gave it 6 or 7 instructions until I finally got the one that I wanted. And I learned, I have a son who knows it very well. And he said, you have to be very specific. Ask it exactly what you want and tell it what you're looking for. So I kept refining my questions. And so there is a little gray matter that went into working with that system, and then the editing afterwards. But yes, so Heidi, the easy answer, quick answer to your question is I found it very credible, and I felt fine. First of all, I said it. I said so. I said, I didn't even say a caveat. I said you should know that ChatGPT was used to come up with this analysis, and I felt fine with it being in the data analysis that we presented under our names.
What question did you end up with? Do you remember?
I wish I remembered. I knew it was something not particularly sophisticated, but please take the data and rank order the 5 key values that are underlying the preferences. I don't remember. Daniella, do you remember?
Yeah, I think because we were looking for a summary of each of the comments related to each option.
Right.
So then we would take like the first 100 responses for example, X, option X. So then, ChatGPT, please summarize this according to, let's say, I'm trying to remember the focus. We would say maybe according to, working in small groups, for example, and pre-K, and like take those themes and summarize them. What did people say about this in 900 words?
I'm realizing now I can find it because it has a record of the responses and the questions. So Heidi, I can find it and send it to you later.
Okay, great.
And then with the link to the survey for folks who might be interested in looking at it.
And I have to admit, I didn't have time to look at the survey.
I just sent it. Yeah.
Did it include the ChatGPT analysis or not?
Yes, of course. That's my point, that I wanted to give people back a summary of their data, both the quantitative data and the qualitative.
Did you give them the raw data too?
They had access to the raw data if they wanted it. They had to, it was in an appendix. So yes, they did.
Okay, so, but what I'm hearing is that you didn't ask ChatGPT to try to develop a consensus position out of this.
Oh, no, not a bit. We asked us to summarize the key points of why people had the preferences that they had.
Okay.
Give it to us within 3 pages and bullet pointed into 5 or 6 main themes, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it was enormously useful. I was a little embarrassed to use it at first. I talked to the head of the community foundation, and she said, "Sounds like a great use of it. Let's try." So yeah, we had no pushback in the end. I was interested that nobody came back and said, "What kind of research is that?"
Yeah, right. So you said earlier that you did a whole bunch of interventions, and one of them was the World Cafe, and one of them was this survey. Remind me what the other ones were?
So we did a retreat. And again,
Okay.
I don't want us to take credit for the World Cafe. The Village Mediation gets the credit for that. We helped them frame it. We helped them find some of the resources for it, but it was really their doing. We did a retreat for the board. We did a lot of soundboarding with individual board members and staff members, where we just listened to them. They were under lots of pressure, so we took off some of the pressure sometimes, or supported people. We did some dialogues between some of the different people to support a little bit more perspective taking, like Daniella was saying, happened in the community. We wrote some things in the newspaper. We interviewed lots of different groups, and in that way, had people feeling accurately like they were being heard. What else did we do, Daniella? It's interesting. I said to Daniella when we finished, I wished we'd kept a log, because I can't remember what we were doing with 16 hours a day anymore now that it's over. But we worked nonstop. It was really a joke that I was saying to people when I was getting exhausted, which was not a little bit of a bitter joke, was I'd rather be back in Jerusalem sometimes. It was very tough.
Where things are simple.
Yeah, where things are simple.
Yeah, and I think it was just kind of that general idea, like Joe was saying, of creating a space where people felt like they could be heard, so they themselves could be heard, and then creating spaces for people to be able to hear each other as well. So those sort of different levels of then the conversation being able to move forward, because people were able to step back from their kind of entrenched position and hear others, and then converse from that place. So I think that was important. And we did see dynamic shifting, as people started to hear each other and also started to feel like, oh, this person is willing to listen to me. There is some possibility to work together. We do want the same thing, even though we might be going about it in different ways. We might have different values that are pushing us towards one option, but we actually do want the same thing. So let's get on that same page to work together towards that, even if we don't necessarily agree.
I think one thing also that we did when the first survey effort that we made failed because of so much pushback, we slowed down a little bit and we reached out to a dozen heads of community organizations in town. And we said, here's our draft survey. Can you help us? Can you refine it so that your group, your constituent, we had, all of those 4 different values sets represented by these leaders, so that the folks in your community groups would be excited about answering the survey, would feel that it's fair-minded, would feel that the 4 options that we presented have been presented in simple but fact-based ways. So that really increased the quality of our survey and the participation, because they got them outreach to people. And one thing that we did, Heidi, is we tried to have some playfulness and fun, because everything was so heavy and so hard. So we invited all those community leaders after we got the survey out for a marshmallow bonfire. And actually, in some ways that sounds silly, but we tried to do that. How can we lighten the load a little bit? How can we remember we're part of a community we want to be part of, and that we actually like each other? I wish we'd done more of that.
Yeah. I'm really surprised that you got pushback on a survey. What were people pushing back against?
You really want to know the details?
Just in general, it's surprising to me.
Well, there's this social media group that was really going after almost everything and everyone that wasn't them. And they got a hold of an earlier version of our survey, and they blew it out of the water. It had been revised and
Saying it was biased.
Saying that it was biased and that it was inaccurate. And in fact, we changed it already. The things that they objected to were no longer in the draft in the version that we were going to put out. But they blew it up, and we had to start over. I can give you more details, but that's probably enough.
Okay.
Offline we'll tell you more.
And I just wanted to add to that, because I think it speaks to just how much time and effort went into constructing something that could be seen as valuable to everybody involved. And I think kind of the underlying purpose of kind of our effort, right, to be able to do that, to step back and to go, okay, how can we present something in language that isn't biased, that's only presenting the facts that everybody will be able to take in and respond to, whereas, each group kind of very passionate about their own position, that wouldn't be possible for them to do that. So it was really like a very concerted effort at every stage, even right before sending it out. Okay, read it again. Is this as unbiased as it can be? Are we weighting everything equally? Have we given equal consideration to every option? Are they similar length? Like very, very detailed analysis of what is the language that's going out? How is it being presented? Just a lot of care and consideration with that. So I think it just speaks to like the complexity of something that could appear to be very simple. You're sending out a survey, but actually everything that went into that survey was so carefully considered. And I think that made what we got back very valuable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't use the word unbiased, but I do think it was multi-partial, that we had everybody's sort of values at heart and express that. And this is a good example of where problems and conflicts became opportunities. Once we had to stop the first survey, which was being constructed with the advice of really high-level survey experts. They were all fired, and we had to start again ourselves, which, I've done a lot of surveys, but this had a lot of complexity to it. And oh, shoot, I just lost the train of thought. It was responding to something you said, Daniella, about multi-partial. Oh, here we go. Sorry. That because it was messed up by the folks who were resisting what we thought was a constructive contribution to building a different environment, we then got to make it even better, right? We hadn't had the dozen community leaders helping us construct it. We hadn't had them helping us reach out to get people to fill it out. So this was a good example of where resistance actually led to a creative way forward. Practice
probably a stronger result.
Much stronger, we think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it just kind of emphasized the purpose that we wanted, which was really to get as much input as possible and have the community feel like they were participating, they were being heard, and that the board could take their input and really use it to make a decision and take the widest input that we could get for them, which hadn't been kind of collected in that way until then. So I think that was important. There is one thing I just wanted to add, because I think this is important for maybe people who don't have the context. We're sort of talking about the time pressure involved in terms of the board making the decision, being able to put it on the ballot. I think there's also that piece around the students and the teachers in the schools right now, and the schools in the condition that they're in. We're not talking about, it would be nice to have upgrades. It would be nice to have something done. We heard in one board meeting, there were a lot of teachers giving input, and, students dealing with things like very extreme temperatures. super hot one day, freezing the other day, bats coming into the classrooms, a teacher talking about safety concerns because using the classroom as a lab and then not having time to clean, not having space, students sort of sitting on seats that had just been used for experiments. Like, I think this is important to emphasize because it emphasizes the urgency of the situation and that people are sort of, dealing with these conditions every day. And the longer this gets put off, the more urgent things become for them. And it's not an environment where education can thrive. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that's really important just to kind of understand the actual urgency of this issue.
So I want to just counterbalance that a little bit. And Daniella and I had some conversations about this, which is she was becoming very passionate about these issues, which objectively are problematic, but subjectively people have different interpretations about. Right. So the folks who say, yeah, it could be better, and we could do that through remodeling, wouldn't be moved by Daniella or even the teachers' advocacy that the conditions are not okay. They'd say, okay, but that doesn't suggest that we have to have gold standard. Right. And so we
can fix the heating system.
Right. Yeah. We need a heating system. So, yeah. But so yes, Daniella and I got passionate about things. I'm from Yellow Springs. I care about this place deeply. I want to stay here forever. It's dangerous to do this kind of intervention in my own backyard. And so, our own biases, our own preferences, our own passions got very much engaged in this story. And we had to be aware that with our own preferences and biases, there are different perspectives in the town that we have to keep our detachment from. And mostly we did that by staying out of the public eye. Until the survey, no one really knew we were doing anything. And even since the survey, that's the only thing people think that we did. I think it's actually the least part of what we did. It's the most empirical part of what we did. You can see it and the results are tangible. But the least noticeable, I think, was the most important. And that was about helping to build a different kind of a dynamic in which different views and different attitudes are all seen as internally valid and meaningful, and that any kind of attributional analysis about those evil others have no place in this village.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add about what I said about the schools. I think, it's not sort of coming with the idea of, option 1 or option 2, option 3 or option 4 is better, but more the idea of like it's really essential that something happens. And I think that's what we saw in the survey as well from the town, that people did come to, we realize we need to get to some action, whatever that action is. We need to make a decision and we need to move something because, and the reason why I mentioned the condition of the schools is because as we take more and more time, things are only getting worse and worse. And as Jay mentioned, from the levy failing 6 years ago, things are also getting more and more expensive. So we can't actually afford by any means to delay this decision, to continue to put this off. And that's what I think was like critical about mentioning that there is urgency on many different levels to move things forward.
Very much. Yeah.
So what happens now?
So the board has to have one more consensus agreement. In July, they have to make one more agreement about the bond issue. And it has to be at least a 4-1. So one board member can defect if they want to, but if 2 defect, it does not get put on the ballot in November. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that I don't really know. Actually, I'm not following it very closely anymore. I'm actually trying to detach myself now. A person was just complaining to me about the agreement the other day, and I listened politely and thanked them and left. I want to go back to being a resident. So I don't really know, but in July, the board is to put it on the ballot. I believe that they will. And then there will be I assume it's already starting. There will be a campaign to try to convince friends and neighbors to support the levy. I think there will be a lot of work done on trying to come up with ways that this fund can be meaningful and useful for people, the Leave No Resident Behind fund, I hope. And I'm sure there will still be disagreement. But my prediction, and we'll be able to know how foolhardy this prediction is that it will pass with flying colors in the fall.
Well, I will for sure come back to you and find out. So I want to honor your time, and I'm saying we only have about 5 minutes left. What lessons would you draw from this that you think other conflict transformers, resolvers, engagement folks could use in other communities that maybe don't have school issues but are deeply divided on other issues? What are the lessons that came out of this that are more widely applicable?
Wonderful question. Wish I'd thought a lot about this before you asked it, because it deserves a very, very careful response. But let me try and maybe come back to it. And Daniella, I'm eager to hear your responses. So the first one I'd say is it's a systems problem and it has to be addressed at a systems level. And that partly means intrapersonal, people's feelings and their hopes and their hurts on an individual level. Relational, people's relationships with each other are really core. Groups, the different stakeholding groups and the different interest groups, the different identity groups. And then structurally, in terms of how our organizations are run and led, that all of these factors have to be considered. And that's where your framework was really helpful for me. And that's where having a month of research before I began an intervention was so important, because I had all sorts of ideas while I was interviewing people. And I said, uncharacteristically, I have nothing to suggest. I'm not going to let myself suggest anything. I'm only going to sit back and try to get an analysis. So being able to be a relatively pure researcher for a month was really helpful. And I wasn't sure that I was going to ask to go forward afterwards. This was not a bait and switch. I'm going to research and then I'm going to get you to fund me to do a project. I didn't really want to do this project. I was nervous about doing a project at home. But as I did it, and as I understood what was going on, and as I felt like I was quite equipped for it and I needed help, and so I reached out to Daniella for that help, the notion of a systems analysis that came from your framework, and as well as the work that I've done, and a systems intervention where we would really keep working at every level simultaneously, the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, the group, the structural, the organizational, and try to compose something that would address the constraints and the resistances and build the momentum to have movement in a forward direction. I think keeping out of the public eye was a useful thing, not only because this is my home, but also because it enabled us to ensure people that our conversations were going to be private, that they weren't going to be in the media, that they weren't going to be publicized, but these were quiet explorations to try to rebuild a kind of a civil society that had somewhat been lost. I think my frame of identity-based conflict was useful, that it looks like this is an issue of resources, and surely in many ways it was, but underlying the resource issue of how much a levy would be and what kind of building we'd build were people's sense of hopes and hurts and their own respective sense of identities and values, and that we prioritized all of those. So I think those are some pretty essential core issues. And then finally, the survey, which was an opportunity for people to have voice and for us to consolidate that voice as a constructive input to help the board move forward. So where research and practice really supported each other.
Great. Daniella, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything Jay said. I think the systems approach, it was critical, right? Working at all those levels at the same time. And I think just kind of reiterating what I'd said before about along the way, creating different kinds of forums for people to express what was important to them, what really matters to them, as well as to be able to hear each other. And doing that in different ways throughout, whether it's one-on-one with the person themselves, whether it's two people together, whether it's smaller groups, bigger groups, all of those things I think are critical. And then, like Jay was saying, getting to the values, right? Making the values explicit. What is it that people really care about here? I think makes it easier for people to see each other's perspective and to understand what's at stake. So I think that's an important piece. And then I think also that idea of like, with the Village Cafe, it was a great opportunity for people who were there, but then we were left going, well, who's not here? And I think just for communities that are doing this kind of process to think about whose voice isn't being heard, who is not at the table, and how do we bring those people in to this process?
Critical. Yeah.
I think that's a really important piece. And I think that's what we tried to do with the survey. And I think that made a really big difference. So, and the other piece, I think, is just persistence, the idea that people can be so polarized and so divided, and through the systemic approach and in an ongoing way over a sustained period of time, people can come together and find that integrative solution, that it is possible. I think that's a really important piece as well.
Well, this has really been great, and I have a much better understanding now of what the situation is and what you guys did, and I'm very hopeful to hear how this develops over time. I'd like to invite both of you to think more about that last question about lessons for other people. Jay said that he wanted more time. I'd love to do a second conversation at some point, and I'm been thinking in the back of my head, Jay, all along about how this seems similar and different to what you did years ago in Cincinnati with the police situation, and would be interested in hearing some of your musings about that. And I'm sure there's other things that you've done between those two that would be interesting to talk about. So if you're willing to do a second chapter of this, we'd certainly be interested.
I'd like that very much.
Be great.
All right.
Yeah, and Heidi, I want to say again a thank you to you and Guy, because truly your framework was what enabled me to come in with a researcher's lens that framed, I think, this whole project. So thank you for your work.
Well, thank you very much. We're glad that you found it useful. And thanks for taking the time to do this. We will get back to you before we put it out, as I said. And I'll get back to you about doing a second round. And then we definitely want to talk after the election in November and find out what happened.
Sounds great.
So,
wonderful. Thanks, Heidi. This was great.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thanks
Glad
so
to
much,
meet you,
Heidi.
Daniella.
So nice to meet you too.